Okay, it's been a while since I've done a film review, so I'm going to make a review of the film that I've just watched, a film that I have on DVD, To Kill a King. Try and get the cover there. I think it's a good cover actually. To Kill a King. So this is a Channel 4 film, or Film 4 to give it its correct name, and it's not a well-known film. Produced in 2003, it is basically the story of the immediate aftermath of the English Civil Wars, specifically the Third English Civil War, and the political consequences of the process in which England became briefly a republic. I say England because this was before the 1707 Act of Union, so England was still politically separate from Scotland and Ireland. Um, the film stars Tim Roth, Dougray Scott, Rupert Everett, and Olivia Williams, and basically it focuses very much on the sort of relations between King Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, and Sir Thomas Fairfax. It's necessary, I think, to give a little bit of history here for the benefit, perhaps, of my international viewers. Um, the English Civil Wars, of which there was three, were actually part of a larger conflict known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, or the War of the Three Kingdoms. And if you are interested in history, this is a book I would strongly recommend. Civil War by Trevor Royal. Very often, when we study this period, we see it as the English Civil War, but actually, there was also some very bloody fighting in Scotland and Ireland at this time. In fact, none of the three kingdoms saw as heavy human mortality as Ireland did. Um, this really was a major, major conflict. Collectively, the wars of the three kingdoms may have cost as many as 600,000 lives, which makes it actually equivalent to the American Civil War in terms of overall casualties. And bearing in mind the demographics of the day, this was a devastating, devastating consequence. I should say, had devastating consequences on the British Isles. England itself lost up to 200,000 people. Obviously, battles in this day were many of the casualties came about from disease. They had very, very primitive sort of treatment. It would have been amputation, probably give the soldier whiskey or something to numb the pain, amputation, but many of them died of disease anyway. So these were brutal times, and the civilian population didn't have it much easier. They often had to contend with plague or unpopular garrisons from one side to the other. I'm not going to give a very comprehensive history lesson here because that's not the purpose of the video. But basically, this was a war between royalists who supported the king being absolute monarch and parliamentarians who supported the cause of parliament having more power, basically, and questioning this aspect of the divine right of kings, which Charles I absolutely believed he had the right to. The film includes actually the Regicide, the execution of King Charles I, played by Rupert Everett. And it's a very emotional scene, regardless of your views or your sympathies in the conflict. In my opinion, I would sum up this film as underrated. I think it gets straight to the point. It's not excessively long, which some historic films make the mistake of falling into. For example, I thought Lincoln, whilst it was a good film, was a little bit in the lengthy side. To Kill a King is about 90 minutes, so it's a good length, not too long, not too short. The opening scene opens with the carnage of the Battle of Naseby, which was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and it very much explores the relationship between Oliver Cromwell, who was later to become Lord Protector, essentially Britain's first and only president, and Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was one of the most respected parliamentarian generals. Um, Oliver Cromwell's played by Tim Roth, and Sir Thomas Fairfax is played by Dougray Scott. His wife also has a significant role in the film. She's presented as a close friend of the king. So Fairfax is very much in a difficult position, not only because of his matrimonial issues, but the fact that he is, whilst he was a parliamentarian and he believed in the parliamentarian cause, he was a lot more moderate than Cromwell insofar as he was not one of the regicides. He didn't believe in executing the king. And it's even interesting in the film, depicts a scene where Cromwell questions even his fashion sense, the fact that he still kept his curls. This may sound like a trivial thing, but in this time, fashion was even a statement of political sympathies, and Fairfax could very much be mistaken for a cavalier, i.e., a royalist, because he kept the locks of the day. He wore fine clothes. Um, in many ways, he comes across as the most sympathetic person in the film because he comes across as a principled man, but also a moderate. Whereas Charles and Cromwell are both respectively seen as extremes. Charles is seen as an arrogant, corrupt leader who thinks he was above reproach. Cromwell is seen as basically a tyrant. Now, it is worth mentioning that Oliver Cromwell is still a deeply, deeply divisive figure, not just within Great Britain, but especially in Ireland. In fact, in Ireland, he's seen as a genocidal maniac, much like Slobodan Milosevic is seen in the Balkans, I think it's fair to say. But the influence of Cromwell on British history is absolutely massive. In fact, when we had a Great Britain study in 2002 when there was a sort of televised study to find out who our greatest Britain was. Oliver Cromwell was in the rankings. He didn't get to the top spot, but he was nominated actually by one Richard. I forget the guy's name, but he was a respected historian. And ironically, at the time, he was the man who nominated him was actually a royalist, a monarchist. So the influence that Oliver Cromwell had was enormous. Now, in the early years of the war, he was a lowly private soldier or low-ranking low-ranking general, I should say, colonel. In the early years, he gradually made his way through the ranks, eventually becoming the most powerful man in the land. But the main critique of Cromwell was that power went to his head, and he essentially became a dictator. I think this is the sort of thing that's going to be debated until the end of time. Republicans will see Cromwell as basically Britain's Napoleon or Britain's great savior. The finishing of the film is about 20 minutes after the execution. It sort of starts and finishes with the corpse of Cromwell being hung outside Whitehall. This actually happened when Charles II came back from exile in the Netherlands. He ordered that the corpse of Cromwell, who died of natural causes, well, at least he died of malaria, but by the standards of the day, it was a relatively normal death. He was essentially hung up. His corpse was hung up as a traitor. Many of the regicides, those who had signed the king's death warrant, I believe there was 49 of them, were also condemned as traitors and suffered brutal deaths. Then came our restoration. Now, the wars of the Three Kingdoms, the Civil War, had a massive, massive demographic effect on the nation. England at this time had a population probably at most 5 or 6 million people. So to have 200,000 people killed, this had a massive, massive impact, huge economic impact, um, devastating, totally devastating. And I think this film really, really encompasses it. The film is set slightly after the war itself, but the consequences of the war, to my American viewers, try and think of um, the that period in the 1870s, the Restoration period, post bellum Civil War. Um, so that's pretty much the same effect it had. I think, needless to say, civil wars are the most brutal kind of wars. We only need to look at Syria for testament to that. Um, and although this is a long time ago now, it's close enough. Obviously, not within living memory, but it's close enough in my line of thinking to be more poignant, to be more. I think we can relate to it more than Viking invasions and medieval battles. There's something about that conflict that still really has resonance on the British psyche. Needless to say, we are a monarchy today, so ultimately the royalists prevailed. But it really was a profound time in our history. Um, I would argue one of the most important times in our history. Another source that's interesting is this book, published about 15 years ago. British battles. This is more just from the military perspective, and it examines basically military strategy and so on. It covers all notable British and English battles, but it has quite a lot of emphasis on the Civil War battles, and that's an interesting read by Ken and Denise Guest. I should say this other book was by Trevor Royal, and the film To Kill a King is directed by Mike Barker. I think it's a very underrated film. I mean, I don't know if it even got theatrical release or if it was just a television film, but I've watched this a few times, and after watching it tonight, I really wanted to make this review because it got a little bit emotional, to be completely honest. I I'm fascinated by history, and I care deeply for my country, so it's very difficult not to be moved by this. Um, and I think it's superb acting all around. I mean, Tim Roth as Cromwell was great. Rupert Everett, I thought, was an excellent Charles I. So, if you can get access to this film, and I'm saying that because it really isn't a well-known film, check it out, The Killer King. If there's any critique of the film, I suppose it could be that it sort of caricatures Cromwell as a tyrant, as a bit of a madman, basically. There is a scene, for example, when Fairfax feels that he has to rein in on Cromwell's excesses. They have a complicated relationship because they're friends, but it becomes very strained because Fairfax believes Cromwell is going to extremes. He actually plans an assassination attempt. And at the very final few seconds, he kind of jumps in and saves Cromwell. Cromwell then turns around and clearly powers go into his head, and he says the man who Fairfax paid to do this should be burned publicly at Tyburn. Tyburn was the site of executions in London, and um, many of the executions at this particular time were heavily politicized. Many nobles lost their heads for being on one side or the other. It was a very traumatic time in British history. Very interesting time in British history. Um, Final few things I would say the execution scene itself is handled very well. Um, it's not overly gory, but nevertheless, it doesn't really hold back. It shows the scene where a little girl in the crowd, because it was a public execution outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, little girl in the crowd kind of scampers below the scaffold. And obviously, there's no evidence this actually happened, but for dramatic effect, and as the king put out his hands, blood splatters onto her face. The point being that this had an incredible impact on the general population. And immediately after the execution, Cromwell holds up his hand with the king's blood, saying, "Look, it's red, just like ours." And the guy in the crowd shouts, "He was God on earth." And this was the mentality. After the king's execution, there was a personality cult developed around Charles. I should say London itself, unless I'm mistaken, was more a parliamentarian city. Every city in the country had its allegiances. My city, Sunderland, was parliamentarian, whereas neighbouring Newcastle upon Tyne was staunchly royalist, which could explain one reason for the Tyne Wear rivalry, the Newcastle Sunderland rivalry, and that could be echoed all over the country. In fact, Charles made his official capital during the Civil War years Oxford, whereas London was the parliamentarian capital. But nevertheless, the general public had no precedent for this. That a subject, a commoner, Oliver Cromwell, could actually have gotten to a point where he could execute the king. It's quite incredible. Not personally, obviously, but in fact, the identity of the executioner has never been quite established. But this was an incredibly important event, not just in British history, but I would argue in European history. It wasn't until 130 years later that the French had their own regicide with the execution of Louis XIV, of course, during the French Revolution. But the English Revolution preceded this. Um, of course, historians of European history would say its impact was limited insofar as we then returned to restoration of monarchy, whereas the French had bouts back and forth and they eventually became a republic. But I don't think we can underestimate how important this was in British and European history. And that execution scene is very poignant. Um, to the last minute, Charles believed he was God on earth. On one hand, his personal bravery is difficult to question. He faces death very bravely. On the other hand, he was not a good king. This is my own opinion coming in here. He was an absolute monarch, and he believed he was God on earth. I'm a staunch critic of absolute monarchy, so leaving aside Cromwell's excesses, had this been the 1640s, I believe I probably would have been on the parliamentary side. Um, and I think also when we reflect on British democracy today, we have to take into account that parliamentarians of that time literally paid with their lives to pave the way for the democracy that we have today. I think aspects like that are sometimes overlooked by the general public. It's very, very important, and the film really, really explores the political side of this, the difficult decisions that parliamentarians had to make about the future course of the nation. It's a bit like if there's a military coup d'etat today, there's always a real crisis in any country as to what future course will follow. Um, except, of course, in contemporary examples, it's not quite the same thing. To give Thailand as an example, in that case, General Prayuth is staunchly royalist. So in military coups today, it's not always pro-Republican military coups. Very often, it's pro-royalist military coups. This is a very powerful film, and I think on one hand, it's good that it's not better known because it makes it an interesting film to discover. On the other hand, I think it probably deserves more credit. The costume designs, everything. I find it very hard to criticize this film. Um, the only thing might be that maybe they overdo the Cromwell caricature a bit. But no, that's no discredit to Tim Roth. He's a very good actor, especially at villainous or rough sort of roles. So check it out, To Kill a King, about the regicide of King Charles I. Another quick footnote of history. Charles I actually was reputed to have asked for an extra shirt on the day. He was executed in January, very cold winter day, and he didn't want the cold to make it look like he was shivering. There is actually a spot in the Palace of Westminster that purports to be the exact spot where King Charles I lost his head. I've seen that. I've actually stood on the very spot. It's today marked by a gold plaque. Um, so if you're in London, check that out. Fascinating history, very interesting film. Thanks for watching.